The Battle of Goliad was a battle fought on October 9, 1835, and would be the second skirmish of the Texas Revolution. In 1835, Mexico operated two major garrisons within its Texas territory, the Alamo at San Antonio de Bahia and Presidio La Bahía near Goliad. Bahia was the political center of Texas, and Goliad lay halfway between it and the major Texas sport of Campano. Military, civilian supplies, and military personnel were usually sent by sea from the Mexican interior to Campano Bay, and then could be transported overland to the Texas settlements. When Texian settlers staged a minor revolt against customs duties in June, it promoted Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna to send additional troops to Texas. In July, Colonel Nicholas Condell would lead 200 men to reinforce Presidio La Bahía, and the following month, a contingent of soldiers arrived in Bahia with Colonel Domingo de Ugartechea. Santa Anna feared that stronger measures were needed to quell the unrest, and he would order his brother-in-law, General Martin Perfecto de Cos, to go to Texas and, in Santa Anna's words, to repress with strong arm all of those who, forgetting their duties to the nation which has adopted them as their children, are pushing forward with a desire to live at their own option without subjection to the laws. General Cos would land at Campo Bay on September 20th with approximately 500 soldiers. He briefly toured the port and a small garrison at nearby Refugio and led small groups of soldiers to reinforce each of those locations, and the main body of soldiers arrived in Goliad on October 2nd. As early as September 18th, several Texians, including James Fannin, Philip Dimmitt, and John Linn, had independently begun advocating a plan to seize Cos at either Campo or Goliad. As soon as Cos's warships were spotted approaching Campo Bay, Refugio colonists sent messengers to San Felipe de Austin and Montagorda to inform the other settlements of Cos's immediate arrival. Concerned that the lack of artillery would make the Presidio at Goliad impossible to capture, the Central Committee chose not to order an assault, although Fannin, Dimmitt, and Linn continued to push for an attack on Goliad, but Texian attention soon shifted towards Gonzales. After learning of the Texian victory at the Battle of Gonzales, Cos made haste for Bahia. He left with the bulk of his soldiers on October 5th, but because he was unable to find adequate transportation, most of his supplies remained at La Bahía. On October 6, members of the Texian militia in Montagorda converged on the home of Sylavanus Hatch. As their first order of business, they elected George Collinsworth as their captain. Dr. William Carleton was then named first lieutenant, and D.C. Collinsworth became the unit's second lieutenant. After appointing their leaders, the men decided to march on La Bahía. They intended to kidnap Cos and, if possible, steal the estimated $50,000 that was rumored to accompany him. The Texians sent messengers to alert nearby settlements of their quest. By the afternoon, 50 Texians were ready to march from Montagorda. During the march, for unknown reasons, the men fired Carleton and appointed James W. Moore as their new first lieutenant. The following day, the expedition stopped at Victoria, where they were soon joined by English-speaking settlers from other settlements and 30 Tejanos led by Palicido Benavides. Although no accurate muster rolls were kept, historian Stephen Hardin estimated that the Texian ranks swelled to 125 men, and 49 of them signed a compact of volunteers under Collinsworth on October 9th. These men pledged that they were loyal to the Mexican federal government and would harm no one who remained loyal to the Federalist cause. One of the new arrivals, merchant Philip Dimmitt, received a letter from the Goliad customs agent with news that Cos and his war chest had already departed La Bahía to travel to San Antonio de Bahia. The group would march out on October 9th. Ira Igram led the vanguard, which halted 1 mile outside of Goliad. The events that followed are not very clear. According to the memoirs of Mexican General Vicente Fisola, who was not in Texas in 1835, the Texians plotted to draw the Presidio commander, Colonel Juan Lopez Sandoval, and his officers from the fort. The Texians allegedly planned a dance in Goliad on October 9th and invited the Mexican officers. Although Sandoval, Captain Manuel Sabriego, and Lieutenant Jesus de la Graza briefly attended the dance, they suspected mischief and returned to the fort. No Texian source mentioned such a plot. Several other Texians, including Dimit, did enter the town that evening to try and find guides and support for the efforts. Dimit's efforts were successful, and several of the Tejanos who lived near Goliad joined the Texian force. They reported that Sandoval commanded only 50 men and were provided with directions to the fort. As the main body of Texian soldiers under Collinsworth marched towards the Presidio, they became disoriented in the dark and wandered from the road and were soon entangled in a mesquite thicket. While working their way back towards the road, the Texians met Milam, a Texas colonist who had recently escaped from prison in Monterrey. Milam joined the militia as a private, and the group soon rejoined the vanguard. As the combined Texian force prepared for the battle, they sent a messenger to instruct the alcalde of the city to surrender. At 11 p.m., the alcalde responded that the town would remain neutral, neither surrendering or fighting, but several of the locals did, however, supply axes to the Texian militia. The Texians divided themselves into 4 groups, each assigned with a different approach to the Presidio. In the pre-dawn hours of October 10th, the Texians attacked. A lone sentinel managed to give the alarm, but was immediately shot dead. The Texians quickly hacked through the door on the north wall of the fortress and ran to the interior courtyard. Hearing the commotion, the Mexican soldiers had lined the walls to defend the fort. The Mexican soldiers opened fire, hitting Samuel Mcculoch in the shoulder, a former slave whom George Collinsworth had freed. The Texians returned fire for approximately 30 minutes. During a pause in the fighting, a Texian spokesman yelled out that they would massacre every one of you unless you come out immediately and surrender. The Mexican garrison immediately surrendered. Mcculoch was the only Texian soldier to be wounded, and he later claimed to be the first whose blood was shed in the Texas War of Independence. A later law prohibited any freed slave from residing in the Republic of Texas. But in 1840, the Texas legislature specifically excluded Mcculoch, his family, and his descendants from its enforcement. The exclusion was rewarded for Mcculoch's service and his injury and earned him a permanent home in Texas. Estimates of the Mexican casualties ranged from 1 to 3 soldiers killed and from 3 to 7 wounded. Approximately 20 soldiers escaped, and they would warn the garrison at Campo and Refugio of the advancing Texians. Those garrisoned abandoned their posts and joined the soldiers at Fort Lipantitlan. Milam escorted the remaining Mexican soldiers to Gonzales, where the newly formed Texian army was located. The Texian army commander, Stephen F. Austin, later released all the men on the condition that they leave Texas and vow to stop fighting Texas residents. One wounded Mexican soldier was allowed to remain in Goliad, as was Captain Manuel Sabriego, who was married to a local woman. In secret, Sabriego began organizing a group of settlers in the Goliad area who sympathized with Mexico. Texian troops confiscated the provisions they found at the fort. Although they found 300 muskets, most of them were broken and unable to be repaired. Dimit hired 2 gunsmiths who were able to bring the remaining weapons back into service. The food, clothing, blankets, and other provisions were valued at $10,000. The new quartermaster at the fort, John J. Linn, reported that 175 barrels of flour were confiscated, along with a large supply of sugar, coffee, whiskey, and rum. For the next 3 months, the provisions were parceled out among the companies of the Texian army, and they would also gain control of several cannons. For the next several days, more Texian settlers joined the group at La Bahia. Many of them were from Refugio, a sprawling settlement that was furthest from Montagorda. Austin ordered that 100 men remain at Goliad under the command of Dimit, while the rest should join the Texian army in marching on Cosa's troops in Bahia. Collinsworth returned to Montagorda to recruit additional soldiers, but on October 14th, the remaining Texians at Goliad began to march towards Bahia. The loss of Goliad meant that Cos lost the means of communication with Campano Bay, the closest port to Bayar. The Mexican troops garrisoned at Bayar would now need to get supplies and reinforcements over land. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you wish to see more, then please feel free to like and subscribe. I'll see y'all next week.